Her shoes clicked past my door like a metronome, sharp, measured, the kind of sound that divides a hallway into before and after. For years, I learned to treat that click as part of the background. She came, she left, I kept my head down. I learned the rhythm of being invisible in a building full of people who knew my name only when something needed fixing. The morning the flowers arrived, the metronome broke. I was standing over the kettle, watching steam ladder up the window and blot out the distant slice of river when I heard the soft thud at my door. No one rings anymore. Packages are left, notes tucked. I opened the door because curiosity outweighs caution when you live on the 4th floor of a building where people pretend not to hear each other breathing. The bouquet was too precise to be an accident. White roses, a few sprigs of baby's breath, a ribbon tied in a practiced knot. A card lay flattened against the stems. My first instinct was to check the hallway, like someone could be waiting for my reaction with a camera. No one. The corridor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the perfume that always seems to cling to her, the neighbor across from me, always immaculate, always in a kind of armor. The card had 3 lines. Only one of them made sense to me in the way that matters. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. I sat down on the edge of my couch with the bouquet in my lap and felt both lighter and heavier at once, as if the simple sentence had pulled something loose inside me and also dropped a weight there. I am good at small things, fixing a leaky faucet, balancing a household budget until the numbers stop shouting, smiling politely and letting the world keep moving. I am not good at being noticed. It sounds dramatic to say that a plant or a piece of paper could alter the gravitational field of my life, but there you go. Small acts are often the ones that tilt everything. For the first hour, I kept the flowers in the sink, where they looked improbable next to the dish soap and my chipped mug. Neighbors started to glower on their way past my door with that inquisitive look people have when something moves out of its usual place. Mrs. Alvarez from 4B knocked and asked if I needed someone to water them. The kid who works nights carrying boxes for the dry cleaner peered through the peephole. A woman I'd never seen before smiled in the stairwell and said, "You're in trouble now." And by trouble, she meant, you will be looked at. "It could be from your mother," Mrs. Alvarez offered. "Or someone left you a delivery. You should keep them in the foyer. The building manager will say otherwise." "I don't have family here," I said, because it felt like keeping a window open. She nodded like that explained everything. People have all sorts of ways to make their worlds tidy. I put the card on the counter and kept turning it over to look for a name that might explain the next steps of my life. No signature. A few smudges of ribbon, a faint perfume that wasn't mine lingering on the paper. Sandalwood? Citrus? It reminded me of the person across the hall in the same way the click of shoes did, vague, precise, and terribly intentional. I had perfected a kind of invisibility that was useful. When you are always polite and never loud, people assume you're harmless. I pay my rent, complain quietly about the heat in winter, keep my mail from piling up. I also hold other people's small disasters until they don't have to shout about them anymore. Once, on a rainy Tuesday, I gave my jacket to a stranger soaked to the bone on the subway steps because he couldn't hold his wife's hand and cry at the same time. We sat facing the window, and I handed him a paper cup of coffee and a folded receipt I'd saved from the deli. He didn't have to tell anyone what had happened because, for 1 hour, I looked and he could go on without being cataloged. That had been a stupid human thing. I didn't expect it to lead to flowers. If you love quiet, character-driven romance, hit subscribe. After the first day of the bouquet, my life had this awkward tone that felt like a half-rehearsed scene. People nodded to me on the street. The doorman looked like he was gauging whether I had pulled a stunt. The neighbor across the hall, the woman whose shoes had always kept the rhythm of my silence, began to change the way she measured space between us. Previously, she had walked past me with eyes like shutters, closed by design. Now she paused once, halfway between us and the mailboxes, as if the flowers had rearranged her internal map of the building. Her name was Maya Hayes, an easy fact in the way certain things are easy. You read about them in the lifestyle pages or overhear them on a phone call. She worked in something that involved a lot of glass in conferences and presentations, or so I guessed. She left for work in tailored coats and always returned with a faint smell of coffee and electronics. Her life, according to the corridor, was precise and highly curated. We had the sort of acquaintance that owes more to proximity than to personality. Polite nods, requested silence when she needed the hallway to pass with a bag of groceries, a quick exchange when the elevator stopped and the lights hummed low. Now, after the flowers, the nods were loaded. Thomas showed up a week later, with his hands full of apologies and gratitude in a way that felt earnest rather than performative. He is the kind of man whose face opens easily when he thanks you, His laugh arrives before he finishes a sentence. I had met him once in the vestibule near the recycling bins, when his breath trembled and his clothes looked like they belonged to someone who'd been living in transit for too long. He asked me for directions at first, and then for help when the paper he'd brought, some form, wavered in his grasp. "Can you just listen?" he said, not as a sentence so much as an offering. I sat on the steps outside the lobby with him, and we watched a yawning truck of a city go by. He talked about missed calls, about a friend who'd vanished, and about a lawyer who never seemed to call back. I gave him my jacket because his teeth were beginning to chatter. He held it like it was a life raft. I didn't think about his later. I just thought in that moment that a coat and a hot coffee might anchor him for an hour. He sent the flowers 2 days later. It wasn't much, he told me afterward, when I found him folding receipts at the corner table of the bodega. "You helped me keep it together. I wanted to say thank you." Thomas looked like someone who'd been untethered and had found an anchor. He was not a rival. He wasn't a plot device. He was, in his most human definition, a person who felt compelled to repay kindness. That repayment made me visible in a way that terrified me. People who don't usually know your name suddenly have an opinion about you. Maya saw him smile in the lobby. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when the building's logic realigned. The way she turned her head was not the same as a passing glance. Her jaw tightened in a manner I had not seen before. Her eyes found mine, then moved away quickly, as if embarrassed at being caught in the act of noticing. People talk about jealousy like it arrives as a scandalous flash, but most of the time it is quieter. It mutters in the linens of everyday life, folding itself into routines until someone else trips it loose. She began to do small things differently. Where before she would avoid eye contact, now she lingered by the mailboxes and collected parcels with a rigidity that felt like armor. She started to pick an elevator 2 floors lower than hers so she could pass mine when I was leaving for the laundromat. Once, when the city was unkindly hot and everyone in the stairwell was breathing like a marathon had happened in slow motion, she offered me a bottled water with a kind of force I hadn't expected. Her hand brushed mine. It left the faintest tremor, like a bell struck too close. "Are you the one who got the flowers?" she asked once when the hallway was empty enough to pretend privacy existed. "Yes," I said. "They were a surprise." She studied my face for a long moment after that, searching for something she might have missed in the years of running past my door. "They were very public," she said. "People talk." I had tried to explain, clumsily, that Thomas had sent them, that it was gratitude made physical, and like every explanation connected to me, it felt exposed. "You shouldn't worry about what people say," Maya said then, and there it was, an instruction dressed like care, which is to say it was a form of power making itself small. Power is sometimes a soft thing, a well-timed coffee, the way someone arranges themselves in the doorway to make you feel both included and small. I recognized it in her, and because I had always been practiced at looking away, I didn't want to be rearranged. One evening, as rain smudged the city into watercolors and the river looked like a broad, lazy thought, Maya stopped me in the stairwell. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice was low, the kind you use when you do not want a neighbor to catalog a private exchange as gossip. Talking with Maya was like stepping into a room with glass walls. The light was sharp, and you could see a machinery behind her composure. She was not unkind, but she was careful. "Why did he send you flowers?" she said. Not because she wanted to know who Thomas was, but because she wanted to know why he had seen me. "I helped him one night," I said. I told her the coffee and jacket story as simply as I could, leaving out the parts that made me sound like a charity poster. She listened without interrupting, but her fingers pressed a little harder into the strap of her bag, as if holding herself together by force. "You don't have to explain," she said finally. "I know what it's like to be noticed for the wrong reasons." The admission surprised me. Maya had always been the sort of person who seemed supplied with explanations and neat endings. For a second, she looked tired in a way the city does to people who bite down on the edges of themselves. "I don't want to lose what I have. I don't like feeling like things are moving that I can't control." Her white-knuckled grip around the strap made the sentence feel like an apology. Then, in a movement I couldn't predict, she leaned forward and pressed something into my palm. It was a photograph, slightly curled at the edges. On the surface was a portrait of her from years ago, younger, softer, without that practiced stillness. She didn't say anything about it being used for an article or a campaign or some company profile. She simply held the photo out like proof that there had been a time she was allowed to be undone. "People remember what they see," she said, "and sometimes they only see what it's convenient to see." The confession, more than anything else, made me feel suddenly very tired. The building suddenly felt like one of those old ships where everyone knows the route but refuses to change the compass.
We stood there with rain tapping at the window like tiny fingers waiting for us to start moving. The jealousy I saw in her face that night was not cinematic. It wasn't a shout. It was a set of small choices that said, I notice that you are seen. It can be a kind of hunger. And in Maya's case, it tasted like fear. The fear of being outmaneuvered in a world that had taught her to hold tightly to the edges of what she cared about. Would you consider an arrangement? She asked, then stopped as if the words were dangerous. Something discreet, together, for appearances. I stared at the outline of her mouth where the sentence had been. What do you mean by arrangement? I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted.
A contract, she said simply, the word oddly clinical in her mouth. Marriage, on paper. Temporary. We present as a couple so the narrative stops shifting. It would be practical, no romantic. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for partnership of convenience. Mutual benefit. She watched me as if I might explode into rational objections. I didn't. Instead, my first thought was the way being seen had already complicated my life. My second was the weight of a financial ledger that rested, stubborn and unromantic, in the back pocket of my mind. Rent, bills, the little overdrafts that had a way of arriving like late saints. I can't, I started, and then stopped. Contract marriage. The phrase slides easily into tabloid headlines and moral panic, but between two people in a hallway, it is a fragile animal made of intentions and fears. Listen, Maya said, and the heat of something like pleading came through for the first time. I didn't come to you in public to humiliate you or to brag. I came because this is a shield. If we can control what people write, what they say, we can keep both of our lives from becoming a rumor mill. There are always choices people present when they are used to controlling outcomes. For some, the choices are philanthropic. Donate, volunteer, save the other. For others, the choices are contractual. I could have said no, walked away, let the flowers sit and be the curiosity of the corridor. I could have consulted community resources, asked for a rent relief program, asked the building manager if there was a way to arrange my work so exposure didn't put me at risk. I could ask Thomas whether he would testify to the nature of his gratitude if anyone questioned it. I had options. But a line of thinking that includes vocabulary like no romantic involvement and temporary is designed to sound reasonable. It is a language that makes sovereignty feel bureaucratic. If we do this, she continued, stepping closer enough that I could smell the citrus in her perfume, it would be on terms. Equal, temporary, no financial leverage, and both of us can leave at any time without penalty. We formalize it with a neutral third party. We make sure no one is in charge of the other's career. We write it down, okay? We make it honest. She spoke in lists, because lists are a way of making feelings safe. I liked the fact that she said equal and neutral and temporary. I liked the way she insisted on making things accountable. It kept the idea from being merely a power play. But what if they ask questions? I said. My voice had that low, practical register so many people use when they make themselves small in the face of complexity. Then they assume, Maya said, and her tone was sharper now, barking away the softness for a moment. We don't have to answer.
We can be as private as we want. This is about control, for both of us. There is an appeal in control. It says, arrange the variables so that the outcome remains acceptable. But control can look a lot like purchase, like buying silence or affection. I felt both wary and, if I'm honest, a trace of relief at the possibility that my precariousness could be shielded. Why me? I asked, because that question ended the sentence saying I was not an actor in someone else's narrative. Why look for me? Maya hesitated. The glass in her eyes caught a slice of the river light. Because the flowers made you visible, she said quietly. Because that visibility happens to you rather than to me, and I don't understand why. I wonder what would happen if we could hold a story together that doesn't leave one of us exposed. The words were blunt. They were honest in the bluntness of their self-interest. She did not apologize for wanting to guard herself. She did not pretend to be saving me. She wanted a shield, and she was offering a mutual one. I thought of Thomas and the jacket and the coffee, and how kindness had been misinterpreted into romance, the way a good deed is sometimes confused with invitation.
I thought of how often people with means, in jobs, in appearance, in authority, mistook ownership for protection. I thought of the ways in which someone can propose a contract and call it freedom. "You're asking me to become something that will change how people look at me," I said. "That can't be undone by a stamped paper if people choose to be cruel." "We write it however you want," she said. "Equal, temporary, out clause, public statement if people ask. If you want, we'll include a clause that removes any professional advantage or leverage from it. We'll have a neutral witness. We'll set a duration, say a year. And at 6 months, we reassess. If it's a bad fit, either of us can leave with 24 hours notice and no penalty." She was a woman who was used to drafting terms. She used them like someone uses a map to navigate uncertain territories. Hearing her list clauses softened the edges for me, because there was, beneath the practicalities, a small litany of safeguards I could respect. "Why offer this to me in the hallway?" I asked. "Because you were right there," she said. "You don't move to be seen. You don't put yourself front and center. Maybe you understand what it means to be invisible. I don't want to be the kind of person who takes something like that without asking." There was an earnestness under her words that didn't align with my suspicion. She wasn't saying, "I want to buy you." She was saying, as clearly as she could in the strange dialect of negotiation, "Help me keep control of my life, and maybe I'll help you keep yours." I could have laughed. It would have been the right, self-preserving reaction, the absurdity of a contract offered in a stairwell, the cosmic mismatch of our histories.
But part of being visible, undesired as it felt, was that someone had noticed a behavior in me they wanted for their own safety. The offer was imperfect. It was laced with power, but it was also framed with terms that acknowledged my agency. "No pressure," she added, seeing my expression, as if the phrase could soften the pressure of the hallway. "Think about it. If you're uncomfortable, we don't do it. There are other ways. I can help, but I'm asking for this too." I left the stairwell with a flat photograph of her in my pocket, images folding in on themselves. That night I couldn't decide whether to be insulted or flattered. I made a list, like she did: duration, equality, neutral witness, exit clause, because the logical part of me needed a scaffold. The next morning, the building hummed with rumor. People asked if I decided. Kids lofted questions from the stairwell as if it were a game. The door to my apartment had a new visitor, a single white rose lying on the welcome mat, petals unfurling like a small surrender. I picked it up and smelled it, clean, damp with rain and hope, and the faint trace of Maya's citrus perfume. I had options. I could refuse outright and insist on the dignity of privacy. I could accept and sign something that might rearrange my life in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Or I could ask for aid, an alternate arrangement where I could be moved to another unit, where the building's manager helped mediate the visibility, or where a community service could assist me with finances until late notices stopped coming. There were ways to avoid being boxed, but there was also the very human desire to be shielded from chaos. Thomas knocked on my door that afternoon with a bag of groceries, like a man carrying an apology and a peace offering. He didn't know about the rose. He only knew that I had helped him and that he'd sent a small thank you into the world because gratitude needs a vessel. "Did you hear?" he asked, as if the building had become a small town. "About what?" I said. "About the arrangement," he said, and his voice had that curious tilt again. He looked at me not with ownership, but with the kind of suspicion you have for things you didn't expect to be tangled up in. Is this what you want?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. My life, the one I had folded into small, careful boxes, felt oddly public and porous. The choice was not between safety and risk so much as it was between one kind of exposure and another. He sat down as if the hallway could be a living room and told me he was glad I'd been there for him. He offered, quietly, that if anyone questioned the nature of the flowers, he would tell them the truth, that it was gratitude, nothing more. His sincerity felt like a small weapon at my side, truth wielded without drama. "You have to do what's right for you," he said. "If this is something you don't want, don't let someone make you think you owe them because they frightened you." It was good advice, said Honest, but the presence of the white rose on my table kept tugging at me. Sometimes protection can look like a gift. Sometimes it is a cage. The real work was the delineation between the two. That night, I stood at my window and watched the river smear itself into a path of neon. The city was full of people making similar choices, arrangements and compromises that privatized their conveniences. Maya's apartment light was on across from mine. For the first time, I tried to imagine what her inbox looked like, the litany of demands that probably marched through her days like a parade she could not step out of. She had been distant to me for years, and now she had offered a proposition that would change how people perceived both of us. The parcel of privacy we had each been hoarding had been invaded by attention, and the universe of small acts, jacket given, coffee poured, bouquet posted, had made me visible enough that someone with resources decided they wanted to manage the view. I slept badly, which suited me. A life made of routine and careful avoidance is hard to change overnight. The next morning, the photograph was gone from my pocket, but the rose remained on the coffee table with a droplet of water clinging to one petal. The building's rhythm resumed, but the click of Maya's shoes now had a punctuation behind it, as if the corridor was waiting to see whether we would step into a partnership of convenience or let the rumor die. When she knocked on my door that afternoon, it was neither the casual knocking of neighbors nor the awkward knock of someone apologizing. It was precise. I opened the door to find her holding a small stack of paper, tied with a blue ribbon. She didn't hand them to me right away. Instead, she held them between us like a collection of modest demands. The papers were not a legal contract, as the word contract lives in law offices. They were a list, an outline: duration, exit clause, equal public duties, no financial leverage, a neutral witness. I drafted something, she said. Not legal, just to start the conversation. The way she spoke made the word conversation sound like a clean thing you could schedule and then reschedule when necessary. She was trying, inelegantly, to make it less dramatic. Why draft first? I asked, because it felt important to ask who had made the first move and why. Because I'm used to shaping things with words, she said, and it was true. Words were her instrument. If we're going to do this, I want it spelled out so there's no confusion. I picked up the top sheet and skimmed the list. It was tidy in its way. A proposed 1-year period, an opt-out clause with 24-hour notice, mutual public appearances limited to the building and some agreed social events, a neutral witness like a notary or clergy, an agreement to disclose nothing about finances or professional advantages. It read like something someone would bring to a tabletop bargaining session.
Why the notary? I asked. Because I wanted the neutral part to be real rather than dramaturgical. Because public gestures without accountability mean nothing if someone wants to weaponize them, she said. This way, if anyone says anything, we can point to the terms. We show that both of us agreed to this. She watched me then, and the thinness of the hallway made me aware of how visible we were. 2 figures in a narrow shared space, making a decision that could ripple beyond our doors. The offer itself had complexity. It was protective and possessive at once. She wasn't offering a fairy tale or a savior. She was offering terms and ways to protect her public image, and, she insisted, to protect mine too. I wanted to test her conviction. What happens if someone offers you something because they think it will bring them closer to me? I asked. What happens if people see this as a way to get at you through me? Then we make it clear that's not the deal, she said. We emphasize boundaries. If someone tries to use you as a wedge into my world, we'll call it out. We make it part of the terms that neither of us gets special privileges. This isn't about acquiring you, it's about mutual protection. It was the first time she used the word mutual in a way that sounded like it meant something more than a clause in a drafted paper. It sounded like an acknowledgement that both of us had a stake in avoiding rumors and preserving control. Maybe that was naive of me. Maybe it was the sort of hope people get when they look at small, reasonable lists and imagine they will hold. I need to know, I said slowly, that if I do this, I can leave, without penalty. Without. I swallowed the rest of the words, the ones about being branded or trapped. Without anybody being able to say later that I stayed because I had no choice. Then we write that in, she said, and for the first time her eyes softened into something like apology. No penalties, no financial arrangements either way. We'll keep separate bank accounts, separate residences. We will be public partners for a defined period, and that's it. It was an odd safety to demand. Separate bank accounts, as if money itself were a language that could be used to imprison someone. The thought made my chest tighten because money has a way of speaking louder than promises. Who will witness this? I asked. A notary first, maybe a community mediator, someone we both trust. If it helps, I can get references for mediators. Or we can use the community center's counselor for oversight.
It will be 2 signatures and a written statement that this arrangement was entered consensually. The word consensually felt heavy in that narrow corridor. We were taking a heavy thing and trying to make it small enough to manage. "Why are you offering this now?" I asked. "Because the moment we admit motive, we also admit vulnerability. If this is about control, why pick me?" "Because you are not in my orbit," she said.
You're not one of my people. You're quiet. You don't use me. I think maybe that means you'll be honest about what it's like to be seen. And also, because I hate watching things I care about be misread. Give me a day, I said finally. I need to think. I need to ask a few questions and not make a choice from impulse. She nodded, but when she left, she tucked the stack of pages into my hand with a fierceness, as if she had folded herself into the paper. The blue ribbon left a faint indentation on the top sheet, and for a moment I thought of the river being tied off to a dock, waiting for some direction. That night, I made a list of alternatives. I called the building manager and asked if there was any possibility of being reassigned to another unit temporarily. He coughed variables at me and said he would look into it. I found an online forum for tenants and read about people who had navigated similar publicity. I thought of Thomas and whether he would be willing to confirm his intentions in the open if anyone asked. I imagined moving across town and starting again, shrinking into anonymity with a different metronome. And still, the white rose waited on my table like a question. The petals had started to droop at the edges, as if the flower itself were exhausted by being asked to symbolize too many things. I put the rose in a cup and left it by the window where it could see the water and decide for itself what it wanted to be. The next morning, Maya was waiting outside my door. Her shoes clicked as always, but the rhythm felt different now, intentional rather than automatic. Between us lay the idea of a contract, a strange, fragile architecture built of words. She had crossed the threshold and placed a small stack of papers into my hands, and I had said I'd think. This was the moment where things could tilt towards something that looked like mutual protection, or toward a place where visibility would be wielded as leverage. "Will you read them?" she asked softly, honestly. "I will," I said. "But you should know, I won't sign purely out of fear." "Good," she said. "Neither will I. I want this to be a choice." That was the thing, the insistence on choice. She wanted the control not as a means to bind me, but as a way to insulate herself from the chaos of attention. Whether that insulation would keep me safe or make me feel owned remained to be seen. We were, in that hallway, like two people examining a map of property, wondering whether the lines marked on it would protect us, or redraw ownership in ways we couldn't afford.
She stepped back, and for a moment I could see behind her eyes the city reflected. Glass, river, the small bulbs of businesses blurring like scripts. Then she left, the door closing with the same soft finality as all the decisions we deferred. I sat at the kitchen table and read the pages again. The list was almost surgical in its measured concerns. There was care in it, and a kind of arrogance, the assumption that words can stave off the human tendency to assume. There was also, beneath the formal language, an admission that we were both vulnerable. Outside, the river moved on. Inside, a white rose drooped toward sleep in its cup. I could feel, in the quiet between breaths, that the next decision would not be simply a yes or no. It would be an arrangement of spaces and agreements, a negotiation that required me to be both seen and to remain free. When Maya knocked again that evening, it was with the kind of urgency that suggests you've reached a limit and need someone else to hold it with you. She looked different somehow, less polished, more honest. "I wanted you to know," she said as soon as I opened the door, "that I didn't think of this as an imperial move. I thought of it as practical." "Practical is a polite word for many things," I said. "Then help me," she said, and in that asking, there was a recognition that she was as afraid of losing as I was of being possessed. We stood in the doorway with the city murmuring behind us like a third voice. The bouquet on my table watched from across the room, petals catching the light like tiny flags. The conversation that followed would shape the way we walked past each other, and possibly the way we learned to hold one another without annexation.
She reached into her coat, and for a second I thought she would pull out rules and forms and schedules. Instead, she pressed a note into my palm, single-lined, written in a hand I had not placed. I would rather be honest than have the world write our terms for us. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket like the photograph she had once given me, and I realized that whatever I chose next would not just alter how people saw me. It would alter how I was permitted to see myself. I folded the little note into my palm and let the paper crease like an invitation I hadn't wanted. It was easier sometimes to let paper decide what people meant than to hear it and have to parse the tone. I kept the rose at the window. Each morning it looked a little less theatrical and more honest, as if the flower were adjusting to being allowed to be itself instead of a symbol people could read for their own reasons. I thought about the alternatives until they blurred into each other. Moving, asking the manager for mediation, letting the rumor run its course. Each one felt like stepping into a weather pattern I couldn't predict.
Moving would be retreat. Mediation might make people stop speculating. Refusing and letting the world talk would mean being at the mercy of people's imaginations. The proposed arrangement, for all its oddness, offered a kind of architecture. The question was whether that architecture would shelter me or rearrange me. I called the building manager and asked, as I had the night before, whether anyone could shift me to another unit temporarily. He sighed in the way that lets you know his hands were tied. He'd make inquiries, he said, but transfers required openings and approvals. He suggested a tenant assistance program run by the community center that might help with short-term financial relief. He was helpful in the abstract and procedural when it came to human hearts. I called Thomas, who met me at the bodega with his usual easy smile and the small dignity of someone who owed me no drama. "You don't have to sign anything for my sake," he said immediately, the words honest and unembellished. When I told him what Maya had offered, his face took on that half-sad, half-incredulous look of someone who thinks people will do strange things to control what others think. He offered to say whatever needed saying about the flowers if people asked, simply the truth that he had been grateful and that he had wanted to thank me. He was steady. He was not asking anything in return. I liked him for that. I also called a friend from my volunteer days who had done tenant advocacy work. She walked me through the practicalities. Contracts between private citizens can be written to clarify behavior, but they can't bind your soul, she said. Make sure you preserve an exit with real teeth. Make sure finances are separate. If you sign anything that creates dependency, it becomes leverage. Her bluntness made me feel less alone and more equipped. When I met Maya again, we did not meet in the stairwell. She suggested the community center's small meeting room, the one with the heavy wooden table and art from different kids taped to the wall. Sitting there felt less like a scene and more like the beginning of a proper conversation. She had arranged for a mediator, a woman named Claire from the tenant assistance program who smelled faintly of peppermint and had a patient voice. Claire's presence changed the tone. She didn't speak for either of us. She simply made both of us remember that words could create safety if handled carefully. Maya opened the conversation the way she had the papers, precise, rehearsed, but softer at the edges. "I've thought about how this might look or sound," she said. "I don't want to make you feel bought or trapped. I want a shield that doesn't involve ownership. I asked Claire to help because I want this to be consensual in a real way with checks and balances." "Checks and balances," Claire repeated, writing the phrase down. She had a blue pen that tapped the table like a metronome. "Let's outline what each of you wants and fears. We can write terms that reflect concerns on both sides, and then read them aloud so there's no ambiguity." I watched Maya as she spoke. The armor of her public life had softened into the shape of someone making a clumsy admission. The advantage of having a mediator was that neither of us could claim later we had been acting unilaterally. The terms on the paper before us were not legalese. They were earnest phrases on a clean page. We wrote them together. Some came from her initial draft: a 1-year period, an opt-out clause with 24 hours notice, separate finances, no professional advantage, agreed public appearances limited to the building, and a couple of community events. Others came from me: a commitment to a neutral witness, an understanding that either of us could petition the tenant assistance program for emergency relocation without penalty, a promise that we wouldn't use the arrangement to leverage access to each other's friends or resources. Claire suggested we add a clause for reassessment at 3 months and 6 months to ensure ongoing consent, and she encouraged us to identify a mediator who would be available if disputes arose. When the list grew long enough to make the concept feel real, Claire suggested a verbal check. "Before you sign anything down, say out loud what you understand this document to be," she said. "Speak it in your own words. Consent must be verbal as well as written." I felt my throat tighten.
There was a private humiliation in having to declare my own freedom aloud, as if autonomy were something that required an audience to be believed. Maya looked flushed, not with the heat of performance, but with the accumulation of having held everything together for so long. I spoke first because it seemed easier to be practical than performative. I understand that this is a temporary public arrangement, I said, that it is entered into voluntarily, that I can opt out with 24 hours notice, that our finances remain separate, that no one is to use this as leverage for career or money. I understand there will be a neutral witness and that this will be reviewed. I agree only if these terms remain, no penalties, no secrecy about the terms if someone asks, and resources made available if this amplifies any risk for me. Maya's voice was steadier than I expected. I understand too, she said. I want to protect my privacy and the work I do, but I am not trying to own you. I agree that it will be temporary, equal, and without financial entanglement. We will maintain separate accounts and residences. I'll agree to a neutral witness, reassessment periods, and an opt-out clause. If you need assistance relocating temporarily, I will not block that. I will honor your autonomy. Claire asked us both to sign a simple statement of mutual understanding. It read less like a legal contract and more like a pact. We enter this arrangement knowingly and voluntarily. We reserve the right to exit.
We will not exploit financial or professional leverage. We will reassess and confirm consent periodically. When I put my signature on the paper, the stroke felt less like submission and more like clarifying a boundary. The pen mark closed a loop that began, oddly, with a bouquet on my doorstep. Maya signed after me, and the signatures looked like two different kinds of scooped ink. Mine wavered where hers was angular and decisive. Claire suggested we notarized a brief statement affirming both parties had consented with the understanding of the terms. It doesn't make it ironclad in any philosophical sense, she said, but it provides a public record if either of you needs proof of mutual consent down the line. We did it the following day. The notary's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish. The man behind the counter was patient and asked simple questions about understanding and voluntariness. Do you enter into this arrangement of your own free will? He asked me. I looked at Maya, at the apartment buildings across the street reflected in the glass, and I said, I do. Maya said the same. The notary stamped a single document and slid it back across the counter like a small, tangible anchor. The arrangement did not change the rumor mill. If anything, it gave people a narrative to latch onto that felt more comfortable than speculation. The building stopped asking the question and began accepting a new fact, that Maya and I were publicly associated. It spared us both a certain kind of invasive curiosity, which is one reason these things exist. But it also made our walks through the corridor performative. We were a tableau now, a little scene played out in the hallway where other people's stories had once been casual and thoughtless. At first, the practicalities felt like props. We met each other in public spaces on the days we had agreed, nodded politely at building events, and occasionally took photos together for the building's small newsletter. The white rose on my window became less of an accusation and more of a knowing gesture when Maya left one there the morning after our signatures. There was a trace of embarrassment in the way she placed it that made me smile. The flower no longer had to symbolize a hidden calculus. It could be, simply, an offering of attention without ownership. We also took time outside the performative moments. The agreement's existence did not mean our intimacy was preordained, strange as that sounded. What came after was not automatic. There was an awkward period where we both tested boundaries we had written together. She would ask sometimes whether I was comfortable with a certain photograph, small checks that made me feel protected rather than policed. I learned to ask her about events I might be dragged into so I could plan to opt out gracefully. The mediator's reassessment at 3 months became a ritual of honest conversation, where either of us could say when the arrangement felt like a cloak and when it felt like a skin. The first time I felt the arrangement shift from mutual protection into something gentler was not dramatic. It was a shared insomnia and leftover takeout. We had both been awake late, circling the city in our apartments like two ships at anchor and then drifting. Maya knocked and held up 2 paper containers from the Chinese place at the corner. You once told me you liked pepper, she said, as if that were a confession. We ate on my small table, the city's lights painting the walls in stripes. The conversation was not witty or profound. It was about small things that both of us had been hoarding. Recipes, a childhood dog she used to hide under the dining table, the way I always tucked my shirts into my jeans when I wanted to feel less untethered. There was a camaraderie that grew out of the consent we'd given each other to be seen. There were slips. Once a photographer from a lifestyle blog asked for a staged photo of Maya's apartment for a piece about low-key power in the city. She turned the idea down, then hesitated and asked me if I minded if she allowed a single photo where I appeared in the background. I had been for months the visible unknown in other people's stories. This unruffled me. We talked about it that night and agreed that a background presence in a tasteful photo was acceptable as long as we could preview the image. She sent me the draft and, as promised, made sure the photo did not create a narrative that seemed to assign us roles neither of us had wanted. Jealousy, once the catalyst, became something we learned to mention like a household chore, something to be dealt with before it festered. It did not vanish. There were small fissures when either of us felt overlooked. I recall a morning when Maya came home with a new city contact from a tech mixer, and she was bright with excitement. She told me about a project that sounded like it would be a step up, and I listened, feeling a familiar hollow stir. I told her honestly, because honesty was our covenant, that I was proud, and also, privately, worried that this would change how people thought of her and of me. She held my hand and said, "Then we talk about what changes and what stays the same." Her answering the knot with language instead of distance made me feel respected rather than protected. Thomas remained a gentle presence. He would pop in sometimes with a bad joke and a cake. He never lingered in a performative way. He was one more person who had seen something in me once and had paid it back with a small human gratitude. He came to the 3-month reassessment and sat in the corner with a cup of coffee as we walked through the list of what felt right and what did not.
His presence was a reminder that kindness can have ripple effects that never intended to complicate things, and that people who are catalysts are not villains. We kept the reassessments like tending a garden, pruning the corners that had overgrown and planting little experiments. At the 3-month mark, we agreed to lessen formal appearances. We didn't need the building newsletter photos anymore. At the 6-month check, we both said aloud something that felt like confession. The arrangement had become less about shielding and more about choosing to be seen together. Sometimes we scaled back the public facets further and let private moments become the measure of how we defined each other. Money, the stern elephant, never became a weapon. We upheld the clause about separate finances, and that simple structural thing kept envy from creeping in. She did, once, offer to help me with a bill when the air conditioner conked out, and the repair was more than I'd expected. I declined and accepted a referral from the community center instead. The fact that help existed without strings, thanks to the advocacy channels I had explored when deciding, made me feel less beholden. Slowly, the gestures that had once felt like props became gestures of genuine care. She would tuck the corner of my blanket under my shoulder in the way someone does when they're not pretending to be someone else. I learned to notice the way she rubbed her thumb along the rim of a cup when she was thinking, and she learned my habit of speaking to the kettle like it might answer. We read aloud sometimes, a ridiculous thing grown-ups do in apartments when the outside world feels relentless. Once, in a rare moment of softness, she returned my jacket to me folded neatly on a chair with a note, "For when you still give them away." I laughed, half at the memory of that subway night with Thomas, and half at the small holiness of remembered deeds. There were moments of fear. The world has a way of testing boundaries. A rumor once surfaced about a social dinner where someone speculated that the arrangement meant I had ambitions I did not mention. We chose to handle it the way we'd agreed. We issued a short, calm statement to whoever asked, and then we did not amplify the question. That strategy, that refusal to participate in gossip, was its own sort of shield. The year we had written down on that initial stack of papers approached with a quiet inevitability. I remember sitting at my window one evening watching the river blink the city's lights like a slow, patient audience, thinking of the way our life had rearranged itself around a bouquet. I had imagined, in the early days, that if I accepted the arrangement, it would be a kind of surrender born of need. The truth, which I could not have articulated at first, was that the arrangement had given both of us a curriculum for learning how to be seen without being consumed. The decision at the end of the year was not dramatic.
Claire asked us to come by the community center and bring anyone we wanted. We arrived with 2 cups of bad coffee and the nervousness of neighbors taking stock of their own consent. Claire had a small box of Post-it notes and a quiet smile. "Tell me one thing you would change and one thing you would keep," she said. Maya said first. "I would change the frequency of photos," she said, a little embarrassed. "I would keep the way we check in with each other." I said, "I would change the initial secrecy. It made me feel like a curiosity, but I would keep the honesty of our reassessments. They made it possible to keep my autonomy." We had a final short statement to sign if we wanted to continue, and an option to simply let the arrangement lapse into the normal, unarranged intimacy of neighbors who had seen each other through. It was, in the end, the sort of choice people make in life often without fanfare: remain with a known covenant or allow the structure to dissolve and see what remains. "We can end it," Maya said when Claire left us with space, the words lumpy with all the things she had not said. "Or we can keep it.
But either way, I want this to be a choice. I looked at her, at the woman who had once been a metronome of clicks in the hallway, who had offered a contract out of fear, who had since learned to ask for help without taking ownership, and felt a tenderness that was not owed to the arrangement itself, but to the person who had learned how to be less guarded. I don't want the paper to define us, I said. I want the part of what we learned to stay. She smiled, the kind of small, private smile that felt like a compromise as much as it was a victory. Then let's keep what helps and let the rest go. Let's stop pretending that we're only a public narrative. Let's be people who choose each other without the need for a title. We chose to let the formal arrangement lapse and keep the ethos of it, the periodic reassessments, the commitment to separate finances, the refusal to leverage the other's vulnerability. We signed one small note to that effect, less a legal instrument and more a ceremony that honored the intention that had once propelled us into the hallway. The white rose that had sat at my window so long now felt less like a public instrument and more like a shared language. On the day we made that small decision, Maya left another white rose on my table. This time she didn't place it like an offering or an apology. She set it down with a deliberate slowness and said, "For the times you chose to see." There is a difference between being visible to others and being visible to someone who will carry that visibility with care. Visibility can be a kind of responsibility, a recognition that to see someone is not to own them, but to hold them gently in a world that often insists on closing its hands. Months passed that decision.
The building's rumor mill wound itself into new narratives, new concerns, new stories, because that's what people do. But within our apartment-sized world, the rhythm shifted. Maya and I developed a way of being that acknowledged the past without letting it become a shackle. We stopped staging photos. We started making dinners and sharing playlists and letting silences be comfortable instead of fraught. I learned she liked the sound of rain against the window almost as much as I did, and she learned I could be funny in ways that surprised her. There were no cinematic confessions, no grand gestures that rewrote everything. Our closeness came in small increments. A borrowed book left on my coffee table, a late-night walk to fetch takeout, the effortless way we folded our lives near one another. Once, in the blur of a winter night, I found a small envelope on my doormat. Inside was a scrap with her handwriting. "I choose responsibility." Beneath it, she had drawn a small rose. Responsibility is an odd word to pin on affection. It implies labor, attention, and answerability to another. But there is something sacred about it. Choosing to be seen means choosing to hold the image of someone in a way that honors their freedom. It meant honoring my agency in every small choice, refusing offers that felt binding, accepting help when it was truly help, asking for space when I needed it. We never defined our future in the sort of language that newspapers love. We did not marry because the contract had taught us some new script to follow. We learned instead that the most meaningful agreements are not objects to present to the world, but practices to uphold in private. The practice of asking, of pausing, of offering the freedom to walk away, and trusting the other person will not take that freedom as a slight. On a spring morning, one of those days when the river glitters like someone has spilled coins over it, Maya left a white rose on my table again. It was open and simple. She knocked lightly, and when I opened the door, she held out a small pot. "For your window," she said, "something that will last longer than a bouquet." I took the pot and felt, absurdly, the same tide of small grief and small hope I'd felt the morning the first bouquet arrived. "Thank you," I said, "for being careful." She laughed, and it was a sound that wasn't meant to be heard by anyone else. "You taught me how to ask without taking." We put the plant on the sill together. It was not a coronation or an admission of victory. It was a practical thing. Watering, sunlight, attention, and it required us both. We took the plant's maintenance as a small covenant, to see, to water, to tend without owning. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that person on the subway steps and the jacket I gave away. Small acts ripple in ways we cannot predict. Sometimes they make us visible in ways we fear. Sometimes they make space for other people to be less afraid.
Jealousy, I've learned, is not only a danger, it's an honest signal that can reveal vulnerabilities if handled with care rather than accusation. That night, with the city breathing easy beyond the glass, I turned the rose's fragile petals in my fingers and felt the steadying truth. Being seen is not a reward people give you. It's a responsibility we choose to carry for each other. In the months after the contract, that responsibility had shifted from a document to a discipline. It showed up in small things. A text checking if it was okay to post a picture, a call when an old rumor resurfaced, an offer to help without making me feel indebted. If someone had told me a year earlier that a bouquet of white roses would lead to a year of paper and signatures and then to this quiet companionship, I would have said it sounded like a play. But life is stranger and more generous than scripts often allow. The arrangement had been offered out of control and fear, but it ended up teaching both of us how to choose. When I close my eyes now, I still hear the soft click of Maya's shoes in the hallway, but it's less of a metronome dividing space and more of a rhythm I could dance to if I wanted. The city still has its gossip and its cruelties, but within the little orbit we share, I am seen in ways that give me room instead of narrowing me. There is no tidy moral here. I'm not here to tell you that contracts make love or that jealousy is noble. I'm only here to say that human beings will try to protect themselves in ways that sometimes look awkward or cold, and sometimes those protections can be negotiated into something that honors both people's dignity. The key, if I had one to offer, is insistence on choice, on clarity, and on the possibility of exit. Consent that is enforced is not consent. Consent that can be withdrawn is respect. On the first anniversary of our written agreement, we did nothing dramatic. We cooked dinner and ate in the light that spilled from the street lamps, and Maya folded my scarf into a neat bundle and handed it to me, like she had to be careful because the act of giving another person's warmth is a small sacrament. Later, I found another white rose on my table. No card this time, just the simple presence of the bloom. I picked it up and smelled it. Clean, citrus, a little like the way mornings used to taste, and I put it in a cup next to the plant. The two of them looked odd together, but balanced, the way people do when they learn how to stand without leaning. If you could answer me, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done when the neighbor offered a contract in a hallway? Would you have walked away to protect your privacy, or would you have stepped into the architecture and tried to make it humane? Share your thought below. I'm curious how you'd hold a choice like that.
If you liked this quiet, character-driven story, consider subscribing for more slow-burn tales about people figuring out how to be seen without being consumed.